Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Shadows Podcast. I am your host, Trip Bodenheimer, and I am excited today to have with us Scott Mason joining us on the Shadows Podcast. Before we get started, Scott is a business owner. He is an entrepreneur, accomplished executive, and attorney with 25 years plus of public, nonprofit, and private sector leadership. Scott, welcome to the Shadows Podcast.
Thank you. It is so good to be here, man.
I'm so pumped about this. I was telling him his energy is infectious. And to keep up, I had an espresso shot. I had some coffee. I'm going to work out as soon as I'm done with this. But I got connected with Scott about a month ago. And we sat down and had a conversation and instantly
Absolutely
connected. Kept up with him since then. Going to keep up with him after this. But Scott, how's everything going with you in New York?
Energetic. What can I say? It's New York City. It never sleeps. And I guess I can't ever sleep now either.
That was actually when Batista and I were putting this together. One of his first questions was, ask him, when does he sleep? Because if y'all follow him on Instagram, which I definitely recommend you do, you'll see he's all over the place doing stuff. He's got his own podcast. We were talking about you and Oleg. Y'all tag teaming with the little Q&A thing y'all do. It's just some really good stuff that he's out there doing. But how's life in New York right now?
You know, it is better than it was. As you can imagine, and as everyone knows, in March and April of 2020, even into early May, it was a very dark place to be. Sometimes I felt like I was living out an episode of The Walking Dead. I'll never forget one Friday at 9:00 at night. I walked to Broadway, which is normally so bustling and so full of traffic, taxis flying by, cars honking, buses, that you would never dare. It's a risk, even crossing the street. I went to the dotted lines in the middle of the road and just walked up for blocks. Not a car, bus, or other vehicle in sight. It was just me and the road, the middle of Broadway, 9:00 on a Friday night. It's not like that anymore. It's coming back. We're adapting. New York City is, in a way, like a business organization or a highly functional human enterprise. It adapts, it pivots, and it is doing so. And so if there is any place to be that is well positioned to pivot, change, and reemerge in the new world better than before, it's New York City.
That's good to hear, because I remember reading about it, like you said, middle of the year, and just felt kind of surreal. To see what all was going on there. So before we get started, a couple of rapid fire questions for you. And he has no idea these questions I'm going to throw at him. So first one, what is one thing you want to do or see before you die?
What an amazing question. I want to bicycle through Japan before I die.
Ooh, that's a good one.
I have read there is a particular island in Japan that is heavily forested, where it has a lot of the serenity, but also a lot of the highly specialized architecture and sort of lifestyle or cultural attractions that are there that make Japan so unique, and that a lot of people do bicycling through, although not a lot of Americans. And I would be ecstatic to do that. And then also just, maybe spend some time, I don't know if I would bicycle through it, but, spend some time in Tokyo and Kyoto and places like that. Really get a sense of another culture. The more extreme the traveling situations I've been in, or the more different the cultures are from mine, I'm sure you could relate to this yourself, the more I've learned and I've grown. And Japan is one of those areas where it's, from all I've heard, it's not just foreign, it's in a lot of ways almost alien in the best possible sense.
Yeah. Japan is still on my bucket list of places to get stationed. So if I get stationed there, you got a place to stay and come bicycle.
Oh, you're going to regret saying that.
So next question, what is something on your to-do list that never seems to get done?
Get through that monstrous, sick, horrifyingly large pile of books that is right behind this curtain here. I love to read and everything looks interesting. that thing called time to, to plow through all that.
Yeah.
And you're partly to blame now, because you just told me about a book I'm going to have to buy and read. So I'm going to be further behind. when we all stop just telling me this good stuff, I don't want to know anymore.
I talked to Oli. Oli gave me like 3 books the other day, and I was writing all of them down, and I was like, it's going to be August before I'm done reading everything.
Yeah, seriously. August of 2050.
Well, it's funny because when COVID kicked off, I had a couple of books, and I was like, well, this is nice. I can catch up on my reading. But every time we go to like Barnes and Noble or Books A Million,
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by everything. And I'm like, how they run Google. Let me grab this. How they run Chick-fil-A. Oh, a patent book. And next thing you know, I have stacks. I have 3 laying in the living room right now.
And it's the curse of having a curious mind.
That's true. That's true. Okay. What instantly makes you not like somebody?
Wow. 2 things. If I see them discourteous or dismissive of people that are, quote, lower on the totem pole, like, for instance, people that are nasty or snippy or dismissive to the cleaning lady in the office. That to me is a real issue, as someone who has worked, in my teenage year and younger adult years in some of those jobs. I think that's appalling. The other thing too that makes me not like someone, although I'm trying to work on compassion in this area in particular, is if I sense quickly that there's an extreme degree of narcissism. That's Everyone has their strengths. Everyone, needs to have a healthy ego in order to have desire and achievement and some degree of success. But really, when it's all about you, and not when the consideration of other people's is out there, is not part of the equation, I'm really challenged with that. We're social organisms. We are, as the current world situation that we're in now shows, we're all interconnected. And in a way, the situation, the crisis that we're in has illustrated that. A lot of the people that are most essential to the functioning of society and that deserve the most respect are people like who work in grocery stores, who sweep the streets, who are UPS or delivery people or mailmen or women, or garbage collectors. Society cannot function without. Those are essential. People have worked in the pharmacy, in Walmart, put their lives at risk. And so to treat anyone who some might feel is in a lower economic status as less than, when we are dependent on them, actually in a way they're more than all of us, is a significant character issue. But also, I'll be honest about this, the idea that we don't have a responsibility to each other, particularly as someone who views himself as a leader and likes to promote strong leadership, that we don't have a responsibility to those that we are leading, is to me a challenge. Leadership and leadership occurs in a broader spectrum of situations than might commonly be realized. Leadership might just be your leadership role in the house. But if you don't care about other people, if it's all about you, then you're not really leading. You are in a way just a master or a mistress of a house full of people that are or a situation with people that are doing what you want, but you're not really leading.
Conversation hijackers. That's where you really see it, when the boomerang effect, it always comes back to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's boring too, by the way.
Yeah.
Few people are that interesting. I know I'm not that interesting.
It's funny because my daughter works retail. She was working 2 jobs up until like the Christmas break, but at both jobs, so many people would come in and basically just like throw stuff at her and talk down to her because she was working retail at this store. And me being, older and wiser, I'm like, it's so disrespectful. And to her, it's just they're rude. But I think it goes a lot deeper than that. Okay, this is an interesting one because I'll start this question off. It's going to be a little long-winded to kind of lead into it. You are interesting because if I were to file you like in a certain section in the library, you've done so much to where I have no idea where I would even locate the book of Scott Mason. So if you could try a job for a day just to see what it's like, what job would you choose?
No question. Astronaut. Someone
Oh, okay.
on the space station. I want to see the big picture of the world.
Yeah.
I want to see it from the ultimate macro perspective that humans have been able to achieve so far. Not only that, I want to appreciate the aesthetics of this wonderful jewel that we live in. And I want to do something that is so extreme, I'll never forget it. And I bet you, right, even in, if I were to go up in a space station, or the astronauts that have been up there, are on their dying days and they have lost every memory that they have because of some tragic illness, they probably still remember orbiting the planet in space.
That's a very good answer. I just watched the Challenger series on Netflix.
Whoa, was it good?
It's amazing. It's 4 episodes, but it talks about NASA and how they just attention to detail with stuff, but tells the backstories of the 7 astronauts as well.
Wow.
It's really good. I definitely recommend it. Okay. So now, first question, and this comes from my co-host. I kind of tipped you off to it. When do you get sleep during the day?
You know what? I actually say, sleep is very, very important. I tend to go to sleep late at night. I sleep all the way through. I get up and get to moving right away. One thing that, and I'm not one of these people that only requires 3 hours of sleep. I do require a full night of sleep. I make sure I get it.
Mm.
And then I get to create the illusion of not needing sleep because I'm so energized, never being sleep deprived.
Yeah.
That I get that more done. When I wake up in the morning, due to the fact that I'm rested and that I love what I do and I love my life, literally, I can swing my legs right off that bed, jump up, get my coffee, and be ready to go. I was out, up and within 15 minutes this morning on my hour-long walk because I'm fully rested. Keeping energy levels high, coffee is part of the equation. I will not lie, but sleep is the other part.
Yeah, there's a book, Why We Sleep. Don't I know I messed up. I threw that on you.
Just made my problems worse.
But it's really good. I didn't really value it as much until I cracked that one open. But yeah, New York Times bestseller. So now let's get into your story. You have a very interesting childhood. So for someone who hasn't listened, which I don't know why, if you've not listened to his episode of Llama Lounge, but tell us about the childhood of Scott Mason.
Yeah. So I was born in an interesting situation. I actually was born in England. My biological mother was a white British woman that was in graduate school studying languages. My biological father was from Trinidad, and he was in London studying to be an attorney. And they had an affair, and out came my cute little face. And unfortunately, as an unmarried couple in England in graduate school in the 60s, they didn't think my face was all that cute. Or if they did, they were like, it ain't so cute, we can have it around. So they put me up for adoption, which was an act of profound love, actually. And I was adopted by 2 African-American folks in my adopted father was in the Air Force, and he was stationed outside of London. And so they brought me to America, where I grew up in a semi-rural area of Kansas. It was interesting because, Kansas at that time, and I'm sure it is today, had an extraordinarily small African-American population. So my parents were part of a very small group. It was odd, both in my extended family and within the community, to have someone who looks like me. I'm extraordinarily light-skinned. Most people have no idea that I have any black part whatsoever of me. Suddenly just having 2 black parents walking around, and it was a largely white community where there was racism. Some of it was overt, a lot of it was subtle. I also understood at a fairly young age that I was a little bit different, LGBT, and the atmosphere around that issue at that time was extraordinarily hostile. I would say it's probably even pretty hostile today. I mean, there was a church from my hometown where the minister literally pickets people's funerals and says, God hates fags, and has signs up there. And he, was famous for saying that America deserved 9/11 happening because of its acceptance of homosexuality. That's my hometown. Not everyone there is like that, obviously, but it was a very challenging situation to grow up in, especially because of the fact that with my parents both being African American, there were also, on more than one occasion, insinuations made about my intellectual ability due to the fact that there was an assumption that, for whatever reason, I was biologically descended from my parents and had the intellectual limitations that many people perceive African Americans to have. So it was a very difficult. My mother worked in a dog food factory. My father worked for the State Highway Patrol. It was a working class family. Expectations were generally not high for people in my position. I always say, being a manager of a shoe store or going to work for the local Frito-Lay factory were the usual trajectories that you would see people going into. And in a way, it ended up being a good thing that I didn't fit in or was so much of an outsider, because that forced me to understand that there had to be other opportunities for me. Had to. I was desperate for them. I fantasized about them, and I found a way to make them happen.
You said too that you would look off into the cornfields.
Yes.
And dream.
Yes. Yeah. I love to go jogging. And there were cornfields and wheat fields around my house. Sometimes I would jog, 5-7 miles a day. And then there was a meadow behind my house before it got developed into more of a subdivision. But during the time that there was a meadow there was a little creek, and I'd go play with crawdads, and there were turtles there, and I'd make them my pets, and that would be my day. And then literally at night, I would look up at the stars.
Yeah.
I felt, like we were talking about Star Wars in the pre-interview, like Luke Skywalker looking at the dual suns setting. Yeah. That's sort of what that scene has always spoken to me, because that's what I felt like. I would look up at the stars and dream about how there had to be something more. I'll tell you something I've never told anyone else before too. And that is, there were album covers like, Donna Summer or whoever was popular at the time that had these urban landscapes in the background. And I would look at those and try and imagine myself in those album covers, because that was a place I thought maybe I would fit in.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, it's intriguing to me by doing this show, because we've interviewed so many people on here, and so many people in your position that are highly, highly successful today. I would say it's maybe 5 that we've already talked to. They all have one thing in common. It goes back to being on a farm, looking off in cornfields, and fantasizing about a better future. So if you're anywhere near a farm area or cornfields, and you're doing that, it bodes well for your future. You mentioned too, you were struggling with some issues there throughout your childhood, whether it's race, sexual orientation. What were some of were you bullied at times? Did people, kind of target you? Like, what were some of the things you remember as a child going through? Because as a kid, kids are brutal on each other.
Yeah. And honestly, so could the teachers be. And I had a teacher once say to the class something, it was a debate coach that I had, made a remark about how, more or less, it was basically, you can teach monkeys to talk, but you can't teach them how to think, and referring to me. Yeah. And obviously that was a racially tinted remark. I've never forgotten it all of these years later. It was embarrassing. It hurt. In terms of targeting, absolutely. Anytime that you're different, as we know, kids will target you. I was very thin. And again, maybe people thought that I was gay. I don't know if they thought that or not, but they did know that I was bookish. They did know that I wore thick glasses. They did know that I, wore braces. An interesting, weird thing that played into all of this was because I am biracial, my hair is not like a black person or a white person's hair. And so my parents, who were those are the people that teach you how to do your hair or do things with your hair, and barbers, they didn't know what to do with it. So my hair always looked ridiculous. And that added to the whole effect. And so, yeah, people would try to beat me up. Now, the good news is that for whatever reason, skinny, awkward, bookish as I was, I always at least had the common sense to fight back. And so, although people would attempt to bully me, I quickly learned that, even if you didn't win the fight, you got respect simply by engaging in it. But that being said, usually people pick on people that they view as unable to fight back.
Yeah.
So they were usually caught by surprise at the ferocity with which I would respond. And after that, weird human dynamics. One guy attempted to beat me up and we got into a fight in science class. I threw him and put his hand or maybe even part of his body into the aquarium. After that, he was my best friend, wanted to sit next to me every day at lunch. And that gets me thinking to a lot about the dynamics of where are people's bullying instincts coming from? Are they perhaps being bullied at home? And if so, maybe the fact that I did that to him somehow do whatever background dynamics he had, saw I suddenly was someone he wanted to be friends with because maybe that treatment was something he associated with higher status. Who knows?
Yeah.
Fascinating. But yeah, these were real issues. And in an African-American church or in an African-American community organizations, again, where I did not even look Black, that was weird.
Yeah.
And people responded accordingly.
It's interesting because I've brought it up a couple of times now since talking to her, but Shay Sparks, who you and I both know.
Terrific.
She's amazing.
Yeah.
She brought up something. She said it wasn't necessarily, her line originally, but she made it into her own, but it was hurt people. And that was kind of the first part of it. And it's very true when you look back and think of even when we would tend to bully people in our lives, it's been because we've been hurt at some point. But yeah, it's just, that's the comment about the teacher that wasn't acceptable at that time. And can you imagine if someone said that in 2020?
Oh yeah. Especially in the latter part of the year, career ending so fast it wouldn't have even been funny.
Yeah.
And it wasn't acceptable. But as a student, you at least in that day and age, particularly, I grew up. My father was, as you know, and as we mentioned earlier, in the military. There was a very hierarchical approach to how we were raised, particularly with regards to adults. I actually think that there are some really good elements of that, but the downside of it is that I was not necessarily willing to be defiant about it. You just sort of accepted the humiliation and then went on to the next class.
It's funny what you say too about the pushback as well, because there was someone that I got in a fight with one day, and I still to this day I can't even remember what it was about. We were like in 5th or 6th grade, but could not stand this person, and they would constantly come up behind me, hit me in the head, things like that. We finally got in a fight one afternoon, then we became friends. And I don't know, but it's interesting thinking now back to what was their home situation like. Like, what were they going on? What was going on at home? What was, relationships they had with people? Because there was some, root cause that was making them do the things they did.
There was a girl in middle school and late elementary school who had a crush on me. And she was the only African-American girl in at least my 6th grade class. In the middle school, there were other African-American girls, but they were very, very few and far between. She was a very sweet person. She was, attractive. She was very creative. But there was a young man or a boy who was sort of the ringleader of a group of other boys who would ruthlessly make fun of her with these sort of racially charged remarks. They would joke about her swinging from trees in the jungle, and her nickname was XYZ, from the jungle, and they named her nickname was the name of an obscure African country that they had found, right? And people were, she didn't have the temerity, she didn't have the social support, she didn't have the personality really to fight back that way. And So she endured. I think she may have eventually transferred out of the school. I know that after a while she wasn't going there anymore. But in any event, it was terrible. And one of the things that was, interesting about it, I've never really, of course, I had an issue with the person perpetrating that, and I will claim my strategy was to just ignore it, to pretend like it wasn't happening. I didn't want to get involved. I didn't get involved. There were people that supported that girl, and those people I admire to this day because they were a lot more mature than I was. But in any event, I never liked that person because of it, and I've always felt that he was someone that was, horrible, and I would never want anything to do with. Recently, I was talking to someone who knew that the bullying individual, and they started talking about his life, and his life really actually has been sad. And apparently there were real substance abuse issues in his family. There may or may not have been abuse, but his life, this is someone who, based on what this person told me, has had a life that's been very damaged. And I finally felt compassion for this person. I, of course, don't justify or excuse these sorts of behaviors, but what you're saying, the brokenness, what Shay said, the brokenness was the result of being broken and not having the skills to be able to transmogrify that into something positive.
I got another question for you to kind of, we were talking about your adopted parents. What is something that they taught you at a young age? I always like asking this question, that you catch yourself doing today that at that time you didn't see, but now you're like, the beauty of hindsight. I got this from them. I learned this from them.
Great question. I actually think about that almost every day. So all the hard work fell on the boy in the family. I had a sister. She had some chores too, but mine were the tough ones. And if I did not do them, I got in trouble fast, swift, hard. And I didn't get an allowance. But really it wasn't a question. The work was there. I did it. It wasn't when I wanted to do it or how I wanted to do it. I did it. It didn't matter how hard it was. And it was a lot of the manual work around the house, shoveling the snow, mowing the lawn, or the dirtier work, emptying the trash, mopping the floors, even, vacuuming and making sure that of course, and again, as a military person, you may relate with this, even making sure my room was spotless. And, one of the things about that is that I do that as a matter of habit. Our house never falls into disrepair. It never gets overly sloppy. Those things like the dishes being cleared out of the sink or the trash being emptied or anything else of that sort, I just automatically do. And my husband comments about it all the time. He's like, yeah, you take care of this stuff. It just happens. And that is really them coming through, and that was a really great gift that they gave me, although I did not appreciate it at the time. Really, I had kickball to play. Come on, want me to empty the trash?
It's funny. The more I talk to you, the more we find out we have a lot of commonalities, because my mom would have this thing where when I got off the bus, I did my homework. That house better be clean.
Yes.
And by the time because she was going to come home tired, that house needed to be spotless. And at the time I'm like you, I'm like, I got Super Nintendo, I've got basketball, I got friends in the neighborhood, but now my house stays clean. And I'm constantly, but I'm doing it. I find myself doing it with my daughters, and I know they hate it, but you know what? They're going to grow up, they're going to have a house, and they're going to have it spotless.
And let me ask you this one then, because that brings a related issue. I totally forgot until you said this. 3-minute showers. My showers had to be 3 minutes or less. And to this day, my husband comments, you're in and out of that shower so fast. I remember one time I was on vacation and I was on the shower. My dad would knock on the door. 3 minutes are up, Scott. I was like, Dad, we're on vacation. And
it's not our water anymore.
Exactly. Hey, that's a good quality. I'm in and out of that shower.
See, I'm a 20-minute shower person.
Oh, I'm so I wouldn't even know what do you do for 20 minutes in the shower, brother?
Look, they have these tablets at Walgreens. They're like Vicks tablets, and you put them in there, clears you out, clears out your sinuses and everything.
I
So
love it.
I'm in love with those things. So next question for you: what sparked your move to New York City? I know you attended Columbia Law there. Is that what drove you to New York?
Yeah, but I knew I wanted to be in a big city. Hey, my anthem when I was a teenager was Funky Town. I've got to make a move to a town that's right for me, town to keep me moving, keep me grooving with some energy.
What better
And
city?
exactly. And, Columbia Law School happened to be located here. And, being again, not it met my career ambitions. But let's face it, I was also a 22-year-old kid. There were good clubs.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to come get a good education, be around all the excitement and the glitz and the glamour of the big city. But I wanted to go to some good clubs too.
So we'll go with Columbia Law. That's what it's
We'll leave that other part in the past.
So how tough of a transition was it from going from, farmland area to New York City?
Indescribable. Really. On the one hand, even my own parents said, you should have been born in New York City. You're a New Yorker. Mm. And I would walk down the street with a friend of mine that lived here who sort of helped introduce me to the city. And tourists would come up to us and look at me immediately and say, can you tell us how to get to XYZ, and ignore my friend who was born, raised, and lived in Harlem his whole life and asking the question. So I sort of fit in instantly. But the law school situation was different.
Yeah.
I will never forget sitting in the West Village of Manhattan. And it was after my first week of law school. I'd met so many people in that law school, and all of them were so accomplished. And I realized, and I was like, these are just the people in this tiny little law school in the city of, millions of people. I'm nobody. Will I ever be anybody? And looking up at the buildings, I felt like overwhelmed with hopelessness about my own significance. Culturally, the Ivy League, particularly at that level, was a huge shock. The sort of personality that I have, that you see right now, was not something that fit in well there. Words were being tossed around all the time, the ways of speaking that were being tossed around all the time, that perhaps you or some folks listening to this can relate to. These words or these ways of talking would have got my rear end beat up. And so I had spent my whole life avoiding using language in that way, or presenting myself in a certain way. People would go on vacations to places that I could only imagine going on vacation to, and had educational privileges that blew me away. On the law review, almost everyone that got on law review, and which was a token of the higher grades, had as parents either attorneys or law professors.
Yeah,
you're right. They had been prepped for all of this in a way that I hadn't. My second year of law school, I actually worked. And I think I knew maybe one other person in my entire class who worked. Most of them just didn't need to. And Columbia Law School wasn't cheap. It wasn't cheap. Yeah. So to be in that sort of financial position, I was surrounded by people. Growing up in Kansas, there was a certain community of people that were considered the rich people. Those people in a place like Columbia, that's...
Yeah.
Right, like they weren't even a speck on those people's feet, and many times that's exactly how I felt. It was a very difficult challenge.
Looking back at that experience that you had, what's one thing you wish that Scott Mason today could have told yourself back then?
You will find your place, and that the things that set you apart and that made you feel outside of or not good enough there are actually gifts. I'm a cultural broker now. I can relate to anyone. I'm comfortable with other people with Ivy League backgrounds. When the most recent Supreme Court nomination process occurred, there were two women that were finalists, one of whom, of course, is now on the Supreme Court, but the other one was actually in my law school class, and I knew her. And that was one of these things where I realized, I could be conversant with people on the Supreme Court, right? Because she was not anyone that I viewed as any different than myself, although
Yeah.
she's of course far more accomplished as a judge. But but at the same time, I have absolutely no problem relating to that woman who's cleaning the office that we mentioned earlier too. I can hang with her too, and her homegirls. And so that's a huge gift. I can communicate with anyone. Many of those folks can't.
Yeah. You definitely have a lot of connector tendencies that I see, to where I feel like you've never met a stranger.
Thank you. I like to think that if we are a stranger, we'll fix that.
My mom is the same way. We'll go somewhere and she will walk up to the most random person and they're best friends all of a sudden. And she will legit become best friends with that person.
I love your mom. I don't even know her.
So
maybe that's a connection will have to be made.
That is. I'm already trying to get you connected with my wife because it's just infectious, the personality. So you said after that you graduated from Columbia and
Yes.
you had your dream job.
Yes.
Working for the city of New York as an
Yeah.
attorney. Now, my dad was an attorney. We talked about this the first time that you and I connected, but you practiced law for over 25 years.
Yes.
Which I think is incredible. 20 years for the city government. Is that correct?
Approximately. Yep.
Okay. And then social services as well?
Yep. I did a stint with the country's largest domestic violence shelter provider, and it also runs homeless shelters as well as homes for developmentally disabled adults. An amazing organization.
Wow. So I know it's a lot of, to unpeel from that 25 years plus of experience. Tell us some of the things that really stood out during that time, some of the challenges you had to overcome. Just kind of give us a little bit of a recap of that.
Yeah, I'll give you as brief as possible recap of some of the career highlights with the city, because I am proud of those.
Yeah.
And then the challenges flow right from that. So I was very lucky. I worked for the New York City Buildings Department on 9/11. And got to work at the Emergency Command Center afterwards for several months. I also, because of the fact that I had a lot of my responsibilities related to drafting regulations and legislation, was really, 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 really deeply involved in the propagation of skyscraper safety legislation that we believe will save thousands of lives if there is ever such a catastrophe in this city again. That, if I did nothing else with my time with the city, knowing that thousands of lives can be saved because of this, is worth it. 9/11 was a national trauma, but I was uniquely positioned to be able to actually do something about it. After that, I worked with the city's homeless services department and was one of the leads in implementing a major institutional reform that transformed how the city handled pretty much every homeless family who applied for shelter within its borders. This was a huge project. I learned a lot from it. It was great. I then worked for the city's Department for the Aging. The division that I supervised had oversight over 300 plus senior centers, as well as all of the city funded Meals on Wheels programs. And again, one of the things that I led the implementation on, or co-led the implementation on, was the transformation and into a more efficient, cost conscious model of service delivery to seniors. Also, I oversaw the healthy aging unit, which taught me a lot about getting older, and I'm glad for that. After that, I was second in command of the city's administrative tribunal system, and that agency had offices throughout the city and brought in $100 million worth of tax revenue every year, and really was charged with upgrading the operations there. So it was a wonderful experience. I had amazing, phenomenal projects under my belt. The higher I got, the more miserable I was. The more achievements I notched under, on my belt, the more angry and miserable I was. I wasn't fully connected with my purpose. As impressive as these projects and job titles were, they were done for external validation, not because of any connection to my own purpose. And I will never, ever forget, as long as I live, one morning after I'd had meetings, starting at 7 a.m, I went to get some breakfast. I walked outside And as I was crossing the street, I looked to my right and saw one of these metal coffee stands that's on a cart that is on the corner. And the man there was selling coffee for 75 cents a pop. And I was overwhelmed with utter and complete envy for that man. I remember thinking I would do anything, and I mean anything, to live his life. And someone asked me why. Because he was happy. When you would see him in the morning and he'd give you that coffee, he'd have a smile on his face. And that was something I had not experienced in years. And so the mismatch between what was going on inside, and it didn't help that a lot of the supervision and management I received there was abusive. And the atmosphere was one of constant terror, and I was in terror at all times, and I didn't have the tools to deal with it. And so lack of connection with purpose, living in constant fear, extreme stress. There was a period where I had rosacea on my face at all times. My temper was extremely short, because I felt at any point if a mistake was made by someone under me, my own neck was on the line. It was both awesome and awful. And I became a living embodiment of what can happen if you are seeking leadership, career growth, accomplishment for reasons that are from within, as opposed to whatever forces you believe govern the universe guiding you and going through you.
Yeah, there's a lot of meat on the bone with what you just said about that I want to kind of pick apart. First thing is the internal happiness versus the external piece you were talking about. What advice would you have for someone out there who well, let me backtrack that. There's a study, I believe it was Stanford, that shows people would rather do their job, be happy, than they would to get paid a little bit more, to have that title. They would rather go home happy every single day. What advice would you have for someone out there who they're succeeding, but they're still kind of struggling? They're not internally happy. They're not living the life, like you said, of the guy with the coffee pot. What would you tell someone in that situation?
A, to recognize it. B, to understand that no matter what you think are the limitations that are keeping you from doing that, there's a workaround if you're truly committed. One of the things that I let myself get into, particularly with regards to my career choices, was an attitude around agency that was less than honest. I would always say, I don't have a choice. I have to do this. I have to do this because I want my pension. I have to do this because I have student loan debt, which God knows I did, to pay. I have to do this because I don't want people to view me as a failure.
Yeah.
All of those were stories. If you have drive and work hard and have a good reputation, the world will find people like that are so few and far between. The world will find a place for you. But I wasn't willing to say that. I preferred to sort of stay in a victim mode. The world is against me. I keep getting bad bosses. Well, poor me, or I keep having these people working for me that are these 9-to-5 civil servants that can't get stuff done. Poor me. I had choices every step of the way.
Yeah.
They might have been risky, or they might have required me to stretch and reprioritize and be creative, or even to, ask those that love me to sacrifice. But for my happiness, for me to really become and live the life that I am today, it would have been worth it. I never asked my husband, I'm so miserable. Would you be willing to be there with me and accept a reduced income and accept a transformation in my social standing within the milieu that I'm used to if I take a risk and do X, Y? I never thought to ask him, because I was just like, well, I can't. He needs this. He was in school at the time. he might have been willing to say yes. I've learned since then he's willing to sacrifice a lot because he loves me.
Yeah.
We don't know what people in our lives are willing to do for us and how they can adapt if we don't even bother to ask and explore, or what creative solutions are out there. So understanding that these things are things that you have agency over if you claim it
Mm-hmm.
and are willing to make the sacrifices, then they can change. There's no rosacea on my face. There hasn't been for years because I let it go. It all cleared up. I had the same energy level now then that I did now. The problem was it was externalized in a way that was much more hostile, angry, edgy. That's gone. And everyone who knows me knows it. Who do you feel connected, right? You say the energy is infectious and you like talking to me. And I, by the way, feel the same way about you. I didn't have that in me. This gives me opportunity too. It allows me to be a better person and to bring more positivity and good stuff to the universe while I'm feeling good inside. But because I wasn't willing to claim the agency, I wasn't able to claim this either. And so there are also these hidden opportunity costs every time we sit around and take away our agency. Someone in the position you're talking about, we have it.
Yeah, it's, the position I'm in teaching, I'll see people come through and they're a victim. Like you said, they've had a bad leader, a bad supervisor, a bad boss, and they're like, things are never going to get better. But I tell them, like, well, you just hadn't found your purpose. And purpose is something that we want it microwaved, but it's got to bake and it's got to take time. And you eventually get to it, but we want it right then. We want it in a couple of minutes. We want to figure it out. But I had someone I just recently talked to, and they were over the holidays, they were struggling a couple of years back, hated everything about their job, hated the people they worked with, but they were about to get promotion in grade. And they were like, but I want to get promoted. I want to get paid more, but I'm not happy. But once they found their purpose, now they're happy. And they told me, they're like, I'm doing great. This is happening for me. I'm viewed as the leader of this work center. And like you said, all that, the external things happening around you. If you're happy internally, it's incredible the life you can live instead of living for the external people around you. Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yeah, and it's amazing too, because once you understand that purpose, and I completely agree. What brilliant wisdom to give that person. The purpose is found through a process that takes its own time and may not be on your timetable. And the more resistant you are, of course, to acknowledging that you're removed from it, the harder it's going to be for you to get there. But that being said, I feel that by being connected with my purpose, the way I describe it metaphorically is that I am flying down a providential river. There's an electric blue bolt right through that, and it's going through me and it's carrying me. And that's why I mentioned, when, I don't remember if it was during the pre-interview or the earlier part of this podcast, but when I get up, those legs swing off the bed and I'm up and moving because I feel connected to that purpose. I feel excited. Yeah. And that's the side benefit of it. You kind of can't help yourself. You've got a mission. Focus. I'm thinking a lot of times, is this interaction, is this situation central to my mission? Is it adjacent to the mission? Or is it noise? That clarity helps. Part of why I enjoy our conversation, this podcast, but also just our conversations, is that I view the sort of dialogue that we have, even when we're just talking, as mission critical.
Yeah.
And I get so much out of it. That focus enables us to then really exchange and have something more fulfilling happen. The noise, then you can also shut out a lot of negativity or things that are dragging you down. And that's also a beautiful thing. That's just not having your life.
Yeah. Yeah. And, speaking of mission critical, I like to, unfortunately, I like to hear these stories because for especially like a younger audience and believe me, they're out there, because I would have flight rooms that couldn't even remember where they were during this, but there's always those times in history where people remember where they were. For older generation, it's Kennedy assassination, mid 80s. We talked about it earlier, the Challenger explosion.
Yeah.
People remember watching that. But for a lot of the younger generation, it's 9/11. You were in New York. when that event. If you don't mind, take us back to where you were that morning of 9/11.
Yeah, that's actually an emotional discussion. So y'all may have to, there may be a few moments where I'm pausing or collecting myself, but I'm more than happy to share that. I'll never forget that morning because it was so bright and clear and the weather was so nice. I would go to the gym early and then go from the gym to work. And I remember leaving home early that day, getting to the gym early, getting done with my workout, and then hopping on the subway and thinking, oh, I'm leaving early, so I'll have plenty of time to read the news, have plenty of time to look at the newspaper and relax on the subway ride. The subway is always delayed for one reason or another, so I won't get stressed out about that, and on and on and on. And as I mentioned earlier, I was working with the city's buildings department at the time, and there was delay after delay after delay. And they started to announce on the subway that there were delays due to a smoke condition at the World Trade Center. And finally, as I was approaching the Village, which for those who are not familiar with New York City is not that far away from the World Trade Center, it's basically 2 neighborhoods up, a man got on the subway and he said, "That's no smoke condition. There was a plane that hit the World Trade Center." And I remember like everyone was like, "What?" And I was very startled. But I assumed it was a little tiny, like personal plane. And the subway just dawdled along. Then finally I got off at my stop, which was the one on that particular line, the one before the World Trade Center. The streets were just full of people. Everyone was looking up. And sirens were going nonstop. There were fire sirens, they were police sirens, and they were just zooming down towards that area. And I remember walking up and trying to figure out what happened. I spoke to a coworker of mine, and she said, "Oh," and you could see it was as if the hand of a god had scraped across the side of the World Trade Center, and fire was coming out, and things were coming out of it that looked like confetti. In fact, I have a friend who had a fear of confetti for many years afterwards. We now know what a lot of those things were, and it's very, very tragic. But I saw a friend of mine. She said that she had been across the street from the World Trade Center when the first plane hit. She was on the phone with her husband, and literally one of the wheels of the plane dropped down right by the phone booth where she was. And there's a famous photograph of that wheel. And then, there was a lot of sitting around and wondering what was happening. My friend, she went up to an engineer with the city's building department and said, "These buildings aren't going down, are they?" And I'll never forget it. He laughed. He goes, "No way." So I walked up a little ways, and the phone booths, this was at the very beginning of the cell phone era, and it was the old flip phone era. It was not our modern. And the phone booths on the street were not charging people. So I called up my husband and we discussed briefly what was happening. Then we hung up. And the minute we hung up, the ground began to shake, and there was this rumbling that was so loud. It was unlike anything I've ever heard in my life. And people started to scream, and I looked, and I just saw the top of the World Trade Center swinging back and forth, and this massive cloud of smoke. The office building that I worked in was 25 stories. It was twice that tall, coming at me. And for all I knew, I realized instantly it was falling. For all I knew, it was going to fall down right on top of me and everyone there. And so I remember just grabbing the hands of 2 of my coworkers and running. An interesting psychological phenomenon happened. My consciousness vanished. I will never forget this trip. It was as if my brain and everything in me curled up into a tiny ball and went back into my head and receded. It was gone. Scott Mason, the human being, was utterly sublimated. The only thing that I was an orb. And I remember it was a small circular shape that I could even see my field of vision narrowed, that was focused solely and only on escaping. I now think I know what animals experience when they're being chased, like gazelles when they're being chased by cheetahs. And there was nothing else but that run that running and making sure that those two coworkers, my hands were with them, and we ran a long way. I mean, looking back on it, where we ultimately ended up running was, I just don't know how we ran that far, but we did. There was a car on the street. After we stopped running, we walked around a little bit. There was a car on the street, and he had a door open, and people were listening to the radio that he had going, trying to understand what had happened. And as we were listening to the radio, I was there looking at the rubble of the first building, and inside I was breathlessly thinking to myself, well, at least the other one's standing, at least the other one's standing. And a woman was on a bicycle, and she was listening, and she looked at me and she said, I should have been in that building that just fell, but I was running late today. And when she said that, she and I just looked at each other for a minute. Then we both looked at the second tower, and it immediately went down. I remember thinking instantly, it looks like a fountain. But then I realized it was actually more like an anthill with, again, the hand of a God pushing it down. And I remember thinking there are thousands of people, and there's people in the staircases, there are people on the roofs, there are people in their offices, and they're all being crushed. I don't remember saying this, but my coworkers just said, I was like saying out loud, oh my God, holy fuck, all of this sort of stuff. There were groups of people that were spontaneously hugging each other and crying. There was a man in a suit that just went down on the ground face first. There was another man who was like a Wall Street type with a briefcase who was zigging, zagging back and forth, and another Wall Streeter in a suit and tie just got on his knees and started to just hysterically cry. And then another thing that happened that people don't talk about, because it ultimately ended up being nothing, but it wasn't experienced by those of us that were there as nothing, which was all of a sudden all these planes just appeared out of the sky. And people started screaming, fainting, just again, collapsing on the street. And I remember thinking, oh, they're very calm at that point. I remember looking and thinking, oh, we're about to get bombed now. And it's a beautiful day. I never thought this would be how my life ended. I'm about to die. It was just this very detached, oh yeah, okay, this is the end of my life. I wasn't expecting this. Then gradually we realized that they were American planes that were there, right, had been sent presumably to guard the airspace. But in the moment, no one knew that. No one knew it at all. And so, eventually I grabbed my friends and we agreed to walk up to my home, which was 100 plus blocks away. But one touching thing that happened, and I'll maybe close out the story there, was that the buses clearly, obviously, had by and large stopped running. People were walking. For people who were handicapped or who may have had mobility issues or who were extremely, deconditioned, I don't know how they did it, especially if they were living in Queens or somewhere like that. But everyone was walking home. It was just hordes and hordes of people. But there were a couple of buses running. And there was a bus that was completely full of people. And it stopped. And of course, no one was getting off the bus, but it stopped at the usual stops, almost just robotically, even though it was full. And the back door opened. And I remember seeing a middle-aged man in a suit running, trying to catch it. He was very out of shape. And there was an African-American woman there. And as the bus began to go away, she stuck out her hand. And she said, grab my hand, and get on. And, he hesitated for a minute, but then he grabbed her and she pulled him up onto that bus so he could get home. And in a way, that moment symbolized the beauty of humanity in the worst of times. How in that second, race, age, gender, nothing mattered. He was willing to be vulnerable, say, I can't, basically by pleading non-verbally to get on, I can't do this. She was willing to stick out her hand to a total stranger, even though she could have fallen out of the bus herself and there was really no space. The people in there found it. And I thought about it. I hope he made it home okay that night. And so that's my little story. There's more little ripples here and there. But that was the heat of the day. I survived it. so many other people didn't.
Wow, I appreciate you opening up about that. I know that has got to be hard to talk about, and I think you brought up a good point, is that there was kind of silver lining in the whole thing was hope for humanity in terms of us being good to each other and looking out for each other. Because I remember when that happened, everybody became nicer.
Yeah.
Everybody was nicer to each other, and even if it was for like just like a little sliver of our lives. But I remember going to places and it was just, we all changed. Everybody changed. And um, I know it wasn't on as big a scale, but I remember, it kind of, similar to COVID, everything stopped. Everything came to a halt, live events, things like that.
Yeah.
And we were scared. And I remember when sporting events kicked off about, I don't know, 10 days later or something like that, I went to a football game and a helicopter was flying near the stadium. We'd never experienced fear like that because everybody was on watch. And when this helicopter came over, the whole stadium kind of got in a hush, kind of watched this. And then we realized it was like, the news or whoever. But
Right.
it was a scary time. It was a very scary time.
There's two little side stories that I'll share with you.
Yeah.
That relate to that. I think that one is the surprising places where bonds could occur. So I was one of the first group of people that went back to work in the zone beneath 14th Street of New York City, which had opened. And I worked there in the office that I did, which was appropriately, due to a whole other, host of reasons, air conditioning and heating and all that sort of stuff, appropriately sealed so that there wasn't this constant influx of stuff. Now, I did have a weird cough where like this metallic sort of clayish thing would come up for months. Immediately afterwards, once the fires calmed down, the weather, it got cooler. But then there was a day, a month or two later, where it was warm again. And I was working late. And I left the building. And I remember looking down from my office at the streets and noticing that they were kind of, they were dead, of course, but it was more dead than usual. Anyway, I walked to that same subway that was where I'd gotten off on 9/11 itself. And I remember as I opened the door and stepped outside the office, all of a sudden I was overwhelmed with the smell of rotting flesh. It was utterly overwhelming. It was pervasive. And I held my breath and I said to whatever powers there are in the universe, please just let me make it to the subway. And as I walked to the subway, there was a woman walking in the other direction, and she was wearing a turtleneck, and she'd pulled it over her nose and then wrapped a scarf around it. And as we passed each other, and we were the only two people on that street, we just looked at each other in the eye, and we just kept looking at each other. In that moment, we bonded. We were going through something together that was surreal, and those eyes were acknowledging this was really happening. I will bet you money she remembers me as much as I remember her. And that was amazing. The other thing too is regression and safety. So for the first 10 days or so after this happened, when I would sleep at home, I had to have the light on, because I wasn't that I was afraid of the dark anymore. I just was like, okay, if another incident happens, I need to be ready to get up and move. And years later, and this is an interesting irony, and I'm not making any sort of political statement at all with what I'm about to say. I really mean that. I was watching The Apprentice, starring Donald Trump, with my husband when it was cut off due to an emergency announcement by President Obama relating to national security. That's all that said. This program is being cut short due to a matter of national emergency. And I remember turning to my husband and saying, we've kept bikes in the house since then. I said, okay, it's time to pack up the bike. If we need to leave, we can do it now. And that was years later. The announcement ended up being that Osama bin Laden had been killed. But we didn't know that. For all we knew, a nuclear bomb was coming our way, and those were our last few minutes. But like, it created this hypervigilance in me. I was ready to move and prepared to calmly, but with all of the energy that you see right now, get my my rear end and my husband's on that bicycle and out of the city as fast as I could,
On
whether it was
edge.
realistic or not.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. How, you you were talking about the friend of yours that had said he saw people coming out and he had pretty much like post-traumatic stress disorder from confetti
Yes.
later on in life. It's to me, I pray to those people that were there in situations like you, have either seeked help or got the help they need, especially for things like that. Because I could not imagine and put myself in your shoes or anybody else's shoes to be in a situation like that. So thank you very much for opening up
Yeah, thank you
with
for asking.
everything about that. That is, just it's just hard to grasp, what it must have felt like to be in that situation. After everything, you received a 9/11 Hero Award, correct?
I did. Yes, those of us that worked in the emergency command center got that. That was a great experience. There were moments when it was exciting, and there was a lot of like dull sitting around, as you know, in these sort of situations. But people sacrificed their time there. And by the way, the contributions that I had were small compared to a lot of real unbelievable heroes who may have been digging in the dirt, or they may have been inspecting buildings or putting out fires, or, identifying bodies. So my award is truly a little nothing compared to what a lot of people did. But that was also, we didn't know what was going to happen next. I think that was the worst part of it.
Mm. Yeah. So after that, you transition into the nonprofit sector.
Yes.
So tell us about that.
So I had, at that point, before that, I had those other city jobs that I mentioned, and I realized something needed to change in my life. I had a series of bosses where the work environment that I was enduring, I felt was utterly unacceptable. And I also began to realize at some point, if every time I'm working somewhere I have some nightmare experience with my boss, maybe it's time for a change.
Is that the one where, not to cut you off, is that the one where you said they pretty much told you to take a gun and pull the trigger? Was that experience?
That one, and shoot myself in the mouth.
Yeah.
That was the boss before my last one. The last boss that I had, but that was another situation where literally I put a paragraph in a memo that she didn't like. I could easily have cut and pasted it, and my punishment for that was she literally stood up and she had a whiteboard and she began to scream and pound her fist against the whiteboard and say, "You aren't giving me what I want." She was jumping up and down, slamming her fist against the wall, swearing, and that sort of thing. I was just like, again, at some point, it's time for me to
cut bait.
Yeah. And over time, I think that she'd also felt that, she had issues, whatever. It wasn't working out. And so, yes, after a while, cut bait.
Yeah.
And I got a job working for the nonprofit sector. I did that, though, looking at it for the wrong reasons. On the one hand, the mission of a domestic violence shelter service provider, and it also, like I said, ran homeless shelters and homes for developmentally disabled. That's unimpeachable. Yeah. And the one thing that was wonderful about that was, with very few exceptions, the people that worked there were good. Yeah. In government, you got a lot of people whose motivation was 9 to 5, security, a pension, or power. Didn't get that in the with very limited exceptions. You didn't get that. You really had people who were there because they cared about these battered women or homeless, right? They willingly were willing to sacrifice. They may not, you had people in the homes for the developmentally disabled. They were adults who, due to their disability, did not necessarily have impulse control. And so I worked with people who literally had got pushed down the stairs by one of the residents of the home, and would, once they got their arms fixed up and their wounds healed, would be back to work another day for next to no money. That's unbelievable. But it wasn't my purpose. So I had skills and an interest in the area that was intellectual that I could get behind and be there, but it wasn't where my heart was. That being said, I have so glad I had that opportunity. And it was with some exceptions, a great experience. I think from a leadership perspective, the one challenge was that I felt typical of what you hear in the nonprofit sector. There was a lot of emotion-based
Yep.
leadership and not business-based leadership. And so behaviors would be tolerated because there was an emotional investment in the person and not necessarily, whether this was ultimately good for the business or not. But look, that company is growing, it's expanding, and it's doing great work. So, more power to it. I have nothing but good to say about it.
And we were kind of talking about that before we hit record, about the people versus task oriented. So yeah, it was definitely a different spin for you. Now y'all are starting to see why I'm saying I had no idea where to file the book of Scott Mason in the library, because it's not done there. Then
put it front and center. It's that easy. I'll build a stand for you.
Put it at the beginning when you walk in with like the bestsellers.
That's right.
Yeah. So then you from there you transitioned to, was it like a printing business? Was it the Brooklyn Press?
Yep, it was a silk screen printing company for apparel and accessories. Yes. Yeah, so
fill us in on what happened there.
So I was part of a martial arts school. And
tack another one on there.
Yeah, that's right. And Brazilian jiu-jitsu, I will not lie, my skills stank. They got better over time. I was not embarrassed to be myself after a while, but for a period of years, it was pretty embarrassing to be Scott Mason walking into that dojo. But there was, I met some amazing people who were more than happy to kick my ass. And as they, one guy who kicked my ass over and over again, and we had a grand old time. I hate, it sounds weird, but I loved being beat up by these people because
that always sounds good. Hell of a guy, he kicked my ass.
Exactly. He choked me and I, whatever. But, he and I worked together on some projects to support his business. He knew I had an organizational leadership background. He knew I had an operations background. He knew I had a legal background and felt that this would be a great opportunity to set his business up to succeed. And after a while, I'll never forget, we worked together on projects for years. We had such a good time doing it. That one day, after an hour of sweat and brutality directed at me, he was like, "Oh, when are we going to have our next meeting?" And I said, "Look, we're having a great time. Maybe we should talk about a deeper involvement." And he said, "Dude, I'm ready to get in bed right now." And so we had signed, co-ownership papers literally within, maybe a month or two. And then I just, told the nonprofit I was working for that I was moving on. And so began a relationship that for a period of time worked extraordinarily well. And I learned more there than anything.
But when did you decide to move on from that venture?
We had external metrics-based success together. Mm-hmm. I was there for about 3 years. During that time, our revenue nearly tripled and our staff size tripled. And we went from, having clients who were like the local taqueria or the dojos that we trained at to companies like Whole Foods and Kickstarter and national entities, as well as high-end art museums. So we came a long way. We even ended up opening a second location in a town upstate by the name of Newburgh. So we were a 2-city company, which was, in a very crowded industry space and a very fragmented industry space, something I was very, very proud of. But the process of growing and scaling affected us differently. I'm extraordinarily, in all of the projects I'd worked on with the city and even with the nonprofit that I worked in, growing, scaling, building, or turning around and making better had been a big part of what I was doing. And that's what happened. The pace of the growth that we had, as well as what is required of you as an owner of a small business, were things that I think the doing of was the undoing of for my business partner. And so our visions for the future of the company changed. And we're 50-50 owners. We couldn't be have completely different visions for what we wanted for ourselves in the future and still have a viable company. Yeah. And so we amicably decided to split. And he had been in that industry his whole life. There's really nowhere else for him to go. And I didn't want to screw him or the company over. So we agreed he would buy me out. I viewed this with mixed emotions. On the one hand, despite the metrics-based success that we had, I viewed it with some grief and a little bit of shame, because I felt this is a failure on my part. It's not what I wanted it to be or what I dreamed it would be. I also viewed it as an opportunity to really figure out what my purpose was and begin to move to that. I had all of this other experience before, so we both agreed I could transition somewhere much more easily.
Mm-hmm.
And I took the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020 to begin to pump up my raft and go in that river. And that's what ultimately happened with it. And it's the life transition that I have engaged in ever since. And ultimately has given me the honor of meeting you, being a part of your life.
Yeah. And you've now, it seems like you found like, this is my niche. Doing what we're about to get into is the next couple of things. It's not next couple of things in your life, but looking back at everything else that you've done up until, from graduating from Columbia Law up until you left the Brooklyn Press, what are some things you really learned about yourself?
I've learned that I am very adaptable, flexible, and able to respond to changed circumstances quickly, number one. Number two, I respond very well to feedback and run with it.
That's big.
I like to think so.
Yeah.
I'm
feed forward. That's what we call it. Feed forward.
Feed forward. Thank you. I may have to borrow that term.
Yeah.
And I'll, of course, give you credit. and then number three, I've learned that I am indescribably, I would argue, resilient. I didn't always feel that way, but I feel confident in that element of my personality now. And that's given me a sort of inner power that I didn't have before. And I've learned that if someone like me could find that inner power, that a lot of other people can too.
It almost requires you to tap into that resiliency to find that inner power.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to believe that you have it.
Yeah, to believe you have it, to see that you have it, and then believe it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next up for you, and we got a couple of things here to talk about that you're currently doing. Talk to us about, and if y'all cannot see it by now, very accomplished motivational speaker. What got you into motivational speaking?
After my business partner and I split up, I went for a bicycle ride in Central Park. And it was dark. It was rainy. And at the time, I wore glasses. And as I was riding through the park, I found my mind wandering, thinking, how can I take all of the skills and experiences that I have, and what are the gifts that I have, and how can I take them to be where I want to be? In that, as my mind wandered, I had a moment where I realized I actually was asking the wrong question. I was given experiences, skills, but I was also given gifts. If those were not being used, I realized I was actually committing an ethical crime. Because to be given something as precious as life, and then on top of that, gifts, and to be so arrogant as to say, I'll just throw it away. That's, if you have any sense of providence or of belief in anything power, whether it's a God or not, you, I believe, have an obligation to do something with those gifts. What then? And in that bicycle ride, in the rain, with foggy glasses, in the dark, I realized that I needed to ask myself, how can all of these be tethered to service? I had an emotional moment in the dark, in the rain, on a bicycle with foggy glasses, where I was overwhelmed with emotion. And I will not lie, although I'll deny it if you ever confront me in public. I started to cry because I was so overwhelmed with emotion, because I realized a transition had occurred. And so when it comes to answering your question, right, how and why did I move into motivational speaking? The one area of feedback that I have consistently received over and over and have observed in practically every context has been that I can stand up there, I can command a room, I can hold people's interest. I can speak, and I can speak with passion. And by the way, with all of the work experience I have and just age and working on myself, I can speak with gravitas and authority. And that, to me, and I can connect with people. That was the gift. All of us have a gift. This happened to be mine. So what could I do with those? I spent a lot of time meditating, just walking around thinking and letting the universe drive me. And that's when motivational speaking, inspirational speaking, as a niche for me to be in, as a space in that river for me to be riding, became apparent. It almost drove itself.
Yeah. I would have bought a ticket to see you as an attorney. Yeah. But I think that probably had a lot to do with it too, did it not?
I didn't litigate for long because I actually thought that it was primarily negative. Everyone was ripping everybody apart. I hated it.
You think that helped in terms of
maybe I didn't do it
speaking
for long, but I think that in terms of like doing trainings and things like that, it absolutely helped. But a lot of that I would do extracurricular, like I joined a Toastmasters group, or I would, do other sorts of things to sort of put myself out there that way, and it of course helped. Absolutely.
And one thing too is you mentioned Toastmasters, which that's going out there. They get you used to public speaking, and definitely recommend anybody go out there and do it, because I think Jerry Seinfeld once said more people would rather be in the casket than reading the eulogy. And that's how afraid we are of public speaking. But the fact that you're getting out there being a motivational speaker, that's a fear that a lot of people struggle. I struggled with it, believe it or not.
Really?
When I got asked to be an instructor, I had just butchered something speaking in front of the squadron, and it went as bad as it could possibly go.
Really?
I even looked at the guy. I finished talking. I was dry mouthed. It sounded like I was about to cry. I was just fumbling on my words, and I went and sat down next to this guy. And I was like, "How did I do?" And he said, "Let me listen to the commander." And I was like, "Oh, okay, maybe we'll talk after." And no one would look at me after this. We were having to clean up, and I remember I came back, and the guy that worked across from me was like, "Hey, were you getting choked up in there?" And I was like, "No, it's allergies or dry mouth."
Right.
All this. I was trying to play it off. Well, I called my old work center to ask them a favor for something, and the guy picked up the phone. He's like, "Hey, man, were you okay up there talking in front of everybody?" So I automatically had this huge, I was already afraid of it, but now I had this moment to attach with the fear. And I was scarred. And I was like, I'm never going to be a public speaker. So when I got asked to be an instructor, I said, let me sleep on it. Coincidentally, I went to a graduation that next night, and I was still thinking about it, haven't given him an answer. One of the instructors got up there to speak at the podium in front of 300 and some people. But, a lot of people can't speak in front of 10. So I was looking around the room, and I'm like, I have to speak in front of 300 and some people. I'll never be able to do this. Fast forward 2 years later, I'm up there like I'm a comedian on a cruise ship, cracking jokes and all this kind of stuff. And it was, I'd gotten over it, but I took advantage of things like you said, Toastmasters, getting out there, working at your craft. So now, not just motivational speaking, small business consulting firm. You're the principal of Scott Mason LLC, help businesses grow, scale, and sustain. Tell us about that.
Yeah. A lot of business owners get to a certain level because of their subject matter expertise, but they don't have the leadership or management background or the overall organizational background to understand how to run a business, how to even have a true business infrastructure in place, and then how to scale in a way that is safe and sustainable. So that if there are, they face various vicissitudes that any business faces, they're not prepared to do that, or they don't understand their profitability or not. They may have problems accessing capital to grow because they don't have an operational or marketing or other sort of infrastructure in place. They may not have a planning background, so things happen in a way that are all sporadic as opposed to strategic. And they also may not, understand a lot of the basics around hiring, managing, or leadership generally. All of those things, that's fine. Someone like me can provide you with the support that you need in order to be able to tie the entire continuum that your business is together, and then set you up to, in an organized and strategic way and with a clear-minded way, be able to step forward. I will bring to the table, in addition to the substantive knowledge and suggestions and strategy and planning capacity, I'll also bring the ability to think about things from a business perspective. And so, I'm very good, because of the breadth of the background that I had, at asking a lot of the questions or posing a lot of the thought models that one would need to have in order to make well-rounded decisions. For instance, if you're a printer, it could be too easy to make a business decision based on production considerations, as opposed to client considerations, as opposed to insurance considerations, or market placement, or marketing considerations. I also have a vast network, and so to the extent that a lot of business people are working in the business all the time and not out of it, until I'm able to get them to the place where they're out of it, they can leverage my own network to be able to upgrade their strategic partnerships.
Where can people find out more information?
3 places. For the small business consulting, it's www.scottmasonllc.com. They can also find out about me, particularly as a speaker, at www.speakerscott.com. I run a podcast, Scott Mason's Purpose Highway, that you referenced. You can find out about that at both of those places. I also have additional content on my LinkedIn page, Scott Mason. I believe it's S Mason 1, and you can look me up. I believe I'm connected to you on there, so if they can't find me directly, they can find me through you. And I'm always down to chat with folks. I'm a speaker. I like to talk. What do you expect?
Tell us about your podcasting as well.
Yeah. So the podcasting is directed towards building a community of people that are connected to their higher purpose, and therefore building a better self. And I believe this is important, a better world. It's not good enough, I would argue, to just be self-aware and to have built the best self, as the current world situation shows. In fact, as the current world situation presents, from an opportunity perspective, there is a need for a better world. We're walking through a long, dark, and difficult tunnel now. It's full of mist. But one day, hopefully in the not too distant future, that mist will lift, the trees will part, and we'll see what's on the other side. We're going to need to have built and to continue to build better selves, so that the world that's beyond that can be better than the one that led us where we are today. And that's what that's about. I call it a planet's worth of heroes coming together for the journey of their lifetime.
I like that. It's good stuff. If you're not following him on any of these social media platforms, you're doing yourself a disservice. He even tells on Instagram, you told a story that I played for my wife and myself, but it was the one about the Indian food and being on the airplane. And to hear that story, you're going to have to go to his Instagram page and give him a follow over there.
Yeah, but Scott_Mason, by the way.
Yeah, it's worth it. Now talk to us about your involvement with the LGBTQ plus community.
Yeah, so I have a long history of involvement in that. I actually have co-produced a movie that's going on the film festival circuit right now called Stand Up, Stand Out. It is about the history of LGBTQ comedy, the very, very early history of it back in the 70s. And in fact, 2 of the comedians on there are going to be upcoming guests on my podcast. They're groundbreakers. I say, before Ellen was even a twinkle in anyone's eye, there they were out there facing the odds and doing stuff. I have previously been a member of the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. And that's a great organization for business people, particularly solopreneurs, to get involved in if they want to get access to more mainstream services. And, to the extent that there is ever any sort of community building that needs to occur with that community in any of the spaces that I operate, I'm wanting to support that. Gay marriage is legal. Wonderful. We had a gay male presidential candidate. That's wonderful. But the obstacles are still there. The LGBT, especially transgendered suicide rate is high. Transgendered people are killing themselves or getting killed at rates that are truly alarming. And the rates of depression and substance abuse and alcohol abuse and addiction, all these other challenges are, to me, evidence of the inordinate degree of stress that community faces. And so it's something I have a long-term commitment to, and I have no intent of that changing.
Yeah, I was telling you before we came on the air about the episode we recorded the other day with the Boca Negras, which I definitely, I hate to say like a certain episode is a must listen to, because then it almost like downplays the other ones. But that's definitely a must listen to episode, because they tackle a lot of those same issues that you talk about as well. I don't like to use the term barriers, because I think barriers are something that they stop us from getting to a certain point. But what is like a hurdle that, both in personal and professional lives, like looking back at your life, what was that toughest hurdle that you had to overcome to get you to where you are today?
Facing the fear to say you screwed up or needed to change, Scott Mason. Particularly if you're feeling vulnerable, particularly if you feel precarious in your life position, or particularly if you feel like you're someone that people will judge negatively or are predisposed to judge negatively, it can be very difficult to face the truth about yourself. So I would say the biggest leap that I've had to make has been to get myself in the habit of it, to say, Scott, true courage is facing that.
Yeah.
Working through the shame you might feel looking in the mirror around it, or the embarrassment, but facing it and then committing to change. I will never sit up here and say that I've been perfect. I haven't been, or that I haven't made mistakes, or that I haven't been a jerk. I have been. What I can do is face it. It might take me some time sometimes, because sometimes it's really hard.
Yeah.
But as leaders, if we don't do that, everything that we're associated with, our mission, will collapse.
Yeah, in marriage too.
Marriage.
Marriage is a big one.
Fortunately, my husband is very good at helping me along with identifying the areas that I need to change in.
My wife is this. It's funny. I had a conversation with her earlier, and I told her, I said, I've realized that I do this. But then when she repeated it back to me, I was given a little bit of pushback, and I was like, I just admitted to her that I do this, and why am I giving It's funny how that works.
Yeah. But, isn't it important, I feel, to have that person in your primary, romantic relationship?
Absolutely.
As that person? I've seen people who basically have married or been in long-term relationships with people that are sycophantic. In fact, I had a boss once who was like, I want my spouse to be someone that's always praising me and always telling me what I want to hear, and understands that I'm right. I don't want that. I want him to support me and be there for me.
Push you.
Yes, but not to always tell me I'm right.
Yeah. And I brought up another thing too. There's, a couple of classes that I teach, and one of them, which was, we talk about being productive and present when there's not enough time. And we talk about having this reverse gear in your car and be able to back up and say that you're wrong on something. And I said, I don't know what it is, but for whatever reason, you can tell me I'm wrong. You and I got a very good connection. You can tell me I'm wrong on something. I'm gonna be like, wow, I didn't realize that. A coworker can tell me I'm wrong on something. I may get a little bit more pushback to them, but when a spouse does it, we don't want to, even when we know we did something wrong, we don't necessarily want to back up and say, you know what, time out. This whole argument is my fault. But I have people that are listening to this lesson. I'm like, what do you get for saying that? And they're like, pride. I'm like, what has pride ever gotten you? What do you have hanging up in your house because of pride? Totally. What do you level up? Do you get bonus pay? Like, what does pride get you? And I never get an answer. It's always, if I do get an answer, it's selfish. But I'm like, pride gets me a night on the couch. Pride gets me, animosity and disdain temporarily. And some stuff, it lingers on for years and years and years. So I just think that's really interesting. And I think that's a good barrier, because I think a lot more people probably struggle with that. Hopefully a listener is listening to this and they're at that point where they're like, yeah, I need to change with that. I do.
Yeah.
What advice would you give? Because you've talked about this with several different people. Somebody works with someone who is just such a difficult coworker to get along with. What advice would you give someone? Because I get asked that a lot.
Yeah. Two things. First of all, understand unequivocally your own worth. The situations in which I have been challenged with that have been those in which I underestimated my own worth, and therefore was willing to compromise or give or even behave in ways that subconsciously sent signals that I was an appropriate target for that. And that was something, it's easy to just point your finger at the workplace bully or the difficult person and say it's all their fault. And in a way, it kind of is all their fault. But we have responsibility as to how we respond. And that was something, again, sort of not always accepting responsibility for how I could respond was something that really held me back. So that's number one. Number two, get out. Understanding your worth. Sometimes one of the most abusive people I worked with ever, she terrorized the entire staff. There was post-traumatic stress syndrome, I believe, with the entire staff, but she had a special relationship with the CEO. They rode the train together after work every night. She talked, she sat by his right hand. He tolerated it. It was okay with him. My attitude eventually with that was, now fortunately she ended up leaving, but I was prepared to move on. The worst bosses I had, the bosses weren't going anywhere when I worked for the city. The woman who told me to put a gun in my mouth and shoot, she wasn't going anywhere. So it was up to me to leave. And that sort of goes back to two themes. A, what I just said, understanding your value. Someone will value you somewhere. And then B, what we were talking about earlier, which is, we have to be willing to accept the fact that we have agency and then exercise that agency. And that agency can be to walk out the door. By the way, twice in my career, I've left jobs without other jobs lined up. Oh, the horror, I was told. I didn't care. In the moment, the minute you say, I'm leaving, that power dynamic suddenly changes, particularly if the boss in both cases, this happened with me, the boss appreciated or needed me. And my departure made them look bad or created a huge amount of work. So the remaining time that I had there was wonderful. They loved me all of a sudden and needed me and expressed appreciation left and right. Too late, but it changed things. And then number two, you'd be surprised by the way the universe or just your own abilities and your own network or people who care about you and have not liked to see you abused will find a space for you to reinvent or to recover and move on to something better.
I worked at a job recently where, I told someone that was in a leadership position from that job, I told them, I said, this was the best job I ever had, but it was the worst job I ever had. And because when I interacted with the students, I said it was the best job ever. But when I interacted with some of my coworkers, it was the worst job I ever had, the worst experience. And you're right. It wasn't 100% their fault. It was very close to it. They were just hard people to work with and to get along with for whatever reason. But even if it was that little 5%, it was a little bit on me as well. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. It's finding the right niche, finding the right spot for you. Because I'm in a spot now where I'm like, I'm happy. And it's the same situation I was in before, just a different cast of people. And it's amazing. It doesn't even feel like a job.
Makes me so happy for you, man.
Yeah, no, it feels good. So yeah, I think that's very good advice. Last thing to, kind of wrap this up. What is next for Scott Mason?
I am always on the lookout for new speaking opportunities. So if you or anyone knows of a place where they want a dynamic, engaged, speaker who can talk about finding purpose, who can talk about leadership, and all of the related resilience, all the related package of goods, I'm always here for you. I actually I will be contributing to a book called Gut Grit and the Grind that will be coming out in February. And that will contain my story and some details about, in the similar theme about pressure to succeed and what happens when you invest too much of your identity in that. And I am always on the lookout to meet, support, and help out other small businesses that are looking to grow, scale, and sustain.
That's awesome. And last question. We've joked about it, and this is probably not going to help my collection. What book recommendation do you have for someone out there?
This is an unusual one, but I think it's a powerful one. The best book I have ever read in my life, and that has brought more richness and thinking to me, is a sci-fi book of all things called The Book of the New Sun by an author named Gene Wolfe. This masterwork was written in the 80s. It is a literary masterpiece that speaks on multiple levels in the language of myth and metaphor. But it has stuck with me, been with me, and been my North Star through a number of different circumstances. And look, at the end of the day, you have a Star Wars poster behind you.
Yeah, Revenge of the Jedi.
Exactly. And so I will bet that speaks to some of the folks here.
Yeah, we'll have the link for that, and your small business consulting firm. We're going to have the links for that in the description of this. Thank you very much, Scott, for taking time to do this. I've been fortunate enough to have been connected to you through Joe Bogdan, and
That's incredible.
Oh my gosh, he is, and I'm like his biggest advocate. Listeners probably get tired of hearing me praise him, but sorry. But no, this connection, we connected maybe like a month ago, and we got on here to do just like a little one-on-one pre-meeting, and I left, and I remember my wife came home. I'm like, oh my gosh, I have a new favorite person in life, Scott Mason. So you're absolutely remarkable. I'm singing your praises just like I am his. So
good, because you're going to have to hear me talking about you to folks. So,
and when I go to New York now, I got a connection.
Absolutely. So, absolutely. An inside connection.
Yeah. And that was one of the things you told me. I said, yeah, my wife has been dying to go to New York. And you're like, you've got a connection now.
Exactly. We're waiting for you.
Yeah. You got a connection. So yeah, we're definitely going to take you up on that. But any last comments for our listeners?
Just glad to have you. And remember, no matter how dark it might be, the sun is about to rise behind those skyscrapers.
Like it. Well, folks, that is going to conclude this episode. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. It's all the time we have for the Shadows Podcast.